Hello. Our story begins inside the luminous world between worlds. Ezra walked alone. The pathways were long and winding, confusing him, but also consuming him. He didn't know it, but the Dark Lord the Sith had sensed the shift in the galactic space. The Jedi had accessed the world between worlds, and the Emperor planned on breaking in. The 18-year-old Ezra Bridger didn't know that, and he was simply confused. As he walked across the plains, he came across multiple portals. He heard voices from eons past and eons future. The entire history of the galaxy, without bias, was floating around him. Regardless of what he did, he couldn't change the future. Or could he? Ezra didn't stumble across Ahsoka's portal. She was killed by her master nearly 2 years before on Malachor. Instead, the young Boken Jedi came upon a portal of an individual he did not recognize. Two men, a taller, massive Mun, and a human male, shorter than maybe even Ezra himself. As Bridger watched the two individuals, the alien creature fell forward onto his bed, apparently in a drunken stupor. Palpatine's eyes were visible, the man that Ezra recognized as the Emperor of the galaxy. In the years since his assassination attempt, Palpatine showed himself off to the public through holograms. These were greatly manipulated, but it kept a public-friendly look for the Emperor. He rarely presided over sessions inside the Senate anyhow. Plus, his public appearances became more and more rare with each passing planetary cycle on Coruscant. So to Ezra, he understood what this man was. He knew that the future Emperor was with an unknown individual. What Bridger recognized, though, was a lightsaber on the belt of the Mun man, potentially a Jedi Master. Palpatine had gotten him drunk, and with the draw of his own crimson saber, Ezra readily pulled the Mun man through the portal. Palpatine's saber slashed into the bed, and a piece of Plagueis' robes fell behind, leaving the new Sith Lord with a wondering question. Had he truly killed his master? Plagueis didn't exactly wake up. The sound of the lightsaber and the clobbering of his head against the surface definitely stirred him, but he rolled aimlessly. His senses were clouded, and his eyes rolled backwards until finally opening on Ezra. The drunken Sith Lord grabbed his weapon but didn't ignite it, asking the boy who he was. Ezra told him, but didn't go much further than saying his name. Hago Damask asked to be helped off the ground, which Ezra did. As the Mun finally stood up, he towered over the young man and looked around, rubbing his eyes. All of his confusion started to slip away. He wasn't fully conscious, and truthfully, didn't really know where he was. But even the drunken joy he experienced before what would have been his death was overwhelmed by this change. The galaxy was at his fingertips now, and despite the world being shaky and the ground quaking every time he tried to steady himself, he put pieces together. Ezra, a little worriedly, would tell the Mun where they were, before learning the name Plagueis. The Sith Lord had no reason to fear Bridger. Despite his young talents, they weren't refined, and he wouldn't be a challenge, even for a drunken Plagueis. He did sense the potential of his young savior though, but that wasn't of a concern to Plagueis, not now. A familiar presence, though, presented itself as Plagueis tried to figure out his surroundings, and then he saw him. Sidious, his young apprentice, no longer young. The current Sith Lord reacted with a hint of fear and concern. This was not the same Sidious that won the race for Chancellor, and this was not the same Sith Lord who presided over the galaxy when Ezra entered the world between worlds. By removing Plagueis from his deathbed, literally, Ezra had made the Emperor a paranoiac. Palpatine was distrusting and overly cautious anyways, but he was made even more so without being able to confirm Plagueis' death. Finally, after all these years, almost 30 to be exact, he found his former master, drunken as he was the last time they met. For Plagueis, the trust he had in his pupil dissipated as Palpatine accidentally showed his cards by presenting fear upon viewing his master. Plagueis told the boy next to him that they needed to go, and Sidious readied his attack. Instead of returning to the land of which they came, Plagueis would follow Ezra as Sidious fired electricity down the walkway. The Sith Lord was able to defend himself and Bridger, as they easily escaped out the portal that Ezra came through. The sheer shock would be immense on both of their bodies, but Plagueis would remain alert, grabbing the unconscious Ezra and carrying him. Sabine and Zeb, who were waiting at the portal entrance, were shocked to see the Mun man, but he willingly helped Ezra so they trusted him, because they needed to go. Imperials were firing at them, and with the help of Chopper, the rebels were able to make a clean escape from the excavation site, and return to their cave base elsewhere on the planet. Sidious's greatest fears were now a reality. The location where Hego Damask was supposed to die was searched, and Palpatine, assuming Plagueis returned to Coruscant, began his hunt for his drunken master. Lord Vader, who was elsewhere in the galaxy, was ordered to return to the capital immediately. Hego Damask, on the other hand, had his own issues. He and the rebels were forced to discuss the last 30 years he missed. Ezra became conscious again, and Hego thanked his young friend for saving his life. For Plagueis the Wise, he had a very interesting line to walk here. The rebels were far removed from the Republic. He was saved by a Jedi, and whether Ezra knew the truth or not, it didn't matter. Plagueis had just entered a galaxy he was never meant to see. The great Sith plan, the one he and his pupil created, succeeded, but Palpatine was never loyal to the Way of Two. It served him, and while Plagueis refused to follow the rule especially closely, he hoped to build an empire for himself and his student, unlike Palpatine. The initial conversations between the man named Hego Damask II and the rebel survivors of Lothal were just the basics. Hego was a banker. He had a very important bank with plenty of influence. No one had ever heard of it, and that's because pretty much everyone here was younger than the bank itself, and Palpatine had also taken over its assets and wiped it from the face of the galaxy. What was especially odd for Plagueis was that he needed to find answers himself. None of these people could tell him about his past, or the Republic era Palpatine presided over. Especially now, without Kanan, they didn't have a link to the prosperous era of Republic rule that Plagueis knew more about. As he sobered up though, he'd come to more conclusions on his own. It wasn't easy because out on Lothal, so disconnected from the galaxy, there weren't really any answers. The rebels told him about the Empire and he quite liked the idea of it, an imperial power that ruled over the galaxy. But it did become abundantly clear to him that the Empire was Palpatine's, and his apprentice had betrayed him. As a Sith, it was his duty to be merciless and brutal, but he could at the very least be grateful for those who saved him. Though the fact that there was a young Jedi who didn't recognize him or fear him burdened him greatly. Plagueis was the Dark Lord of the Sith, one of the most gifted beings in the Bainite lineage, and he had simply been forgotten. The only threat to the galaxy was Palpatine, and the Sith Lord of the past needed to diagnose his own approach to this new world. There would be no returning to Damask Holdings, there would be no returning to his apprentice or to the Rule of Two, and he certainly wouldn't have any good graces of a man who just tried to assassinate him. He was betrayed. As a Sith, he knew it was bound to happen. The Rule of Two was designed for that specific purpose, but he did ironically feel betrayed. He, unlike his master, passed everything down to Palpatine, hoping that in their combined knowledge they could attain more together. It seems Sidious had aspirations for his own rule. He and Maul were likely the leaders of the new Imperial regime, and Plagueis was now aided by a Jedi. The Sith Lord and Ezra, in particular, had the most interesting conversation, because Bridger saw the lightsaber. He wanted to know answers. So while the other rebels were handling their own business, it became evident to Ezra that he had just saved a Dark Lord of the Sith. Plagueis was not someone he could just challenge at his young age. This was a Sith of nearly 200 years of refined training, a powerful combatant that Palpatine, even Palpatine, refused to fight in a straight brawl. But what Ezra found most interesting was Plagueis' demeanor. Due to trying to figure out his own placement in the galaxy, he wasn't a brute like Vader. He wasn't arrogant or flashy like the Inquisitors vying for approval. Ezra hadn't met Palpatine yet, so that was a case he didn't have a chance to relate to Plagueis. But this older Sith was like a mystical old man. It's because he was, in all fairness. Plagueis humored Ezra. The boy was refreshing. Most of the Sith plan was unfolding in the days leading up to his would-be death, so having someone who, despite his own planning, have a sense of humor enlightened Plagueis in a way. The Sith Lord hosted alchemic rituals for himself, and meditated on the dark arts in solitude to try and find his own peace. Ezra told his found family about this Sith Lord, and they became untrusting of Plagueis, rightly so, even to him. But Plagueis didn't fear them, and they certainly had every reason to be worrisome of him. The rebels, though, because Plagueis wasn't indirectly or attentively trying to disrupt their plans, continued. He wouldn't be a part of the initial battle for Lothal. He'd remain hidden in the caves, watching as Ezra, the heroic young Jedi, slashed his emerald saber through stormtroopers and fires blaster at other grunts. A poised Plagueis during the Republic era might have played with his food. Bridger was an easy kill, equatable to defeating a Jedi Padawan. His training with Kanan Jarrus was formidable, but nothing that would prove to be difficult for a Sith like him. Though as the rebel fight carried them across the planet to the capital city, Plagueis came to his own conclusion. Without an empire to serve or rule, nor an apprentice to protect, he needed to create a legacy for himself. He certainly didn't believe in the Jedi, Rebellion, or Republic, but he was honorable, maybe more so than the typical Sith. And whether he liked it or not, Bridger did save his life. He at least needed to repay a favor. As the battle raged on the capital city, and Ezra confronted the Emperor inside the Chimera to save Lothal from Thrawn's bombardment, Plagueis entered a damaged Imperial shuttle and sped towards the rebels. As he closed in, he sensed Ezra's essence from the flagship and utilized the shuttle to land undetected. Thrawn knew that Ruck and his troopers were holding the central Imperial hub, and he was specifically monitoring their situation. Since Ezra was with the Emperor, his main directive was the planet itself. Plagueis, like a demon, and now fully sober, moved through the halls of the flagship. Imperial troopers had seen Vader's hallway scene, but they didn't know what a fully mobile and able-bodied Sith Lord like Plagueis was capable of. Stormtroopers were electrocuted, choked to death, cut to pieces, crushed by wall panels. The troops were so quickly dealt with that they couldn't radio for backup. Every new corridor faced his raging saber, and their terror was felt only to Ezra, who denied Palpatine's request. A young man who lost everything, and at the thought of losing everyone else, he chose the light. Sidious was surprised. Ezra was much younger than Vader was when he joined the dark side, so he ordered Bridger's execution as a result. But the Jedi used the Force to save himself, and moved towards the bridge. Ezra would make it there before Plagueis. He'd stop Thrawn from totally bombarding the city, and just as more stormtroopers countered Ezra, he'd see the Sith Lord at his full might. He'd rip through a couple Death Troopers, Captain Enoch, and tell the boy to get out of here. Thrawn fired a shot, and before it hit Ezra's shoulder, it was stopped mid-air. Plagueis shook his head, flinging the blaster bolt back into Thrawn's forehead as the Chiss Grand Admiral fell limp. The Purrgil were now surrounding the starship. They had no time but to make a free jump. Plagueis was truthfully quite impressed. The boy had a knack for surprises, and realistically, who could blame Plagueis for being surprised? From his perspective, an 18-year-old boy saved him from his death and summoned a fleet of Purrgil, which the Purrgil actually listened to him. His connection to the Force was unlike anything he had seen from a Jedi, aside from maybe Yoda. The two of them, with Plagueis' instruction, leapt out of the bridge and braced themselves with the Force on the hull, before the Sith Lord picked Bridger up with the Force and flung him across the wide angle of the Chimera, and with the rest of his own strength, leapt into the air as Thrawn's flagship disappeared into hyperspace. The two would again use the Force to save themselves from the fall, and with the aid of the Ghost, escape from the Imperial superstructure. Ezra's collaboration with Chopper to do the coolest thing ever may have not come to fruition, but there left an important question for the rebels of Ghost Crew, one somewhat comparable to that of if the Empire would return to the fall. What was Plagueis? Yes, obviously a Sith, but he had just done the most anti-Sith thing ever. He put his life in danger to save someone else, and Plagueis did not like the way that made him feel. He loved murdering Palpatine's grunts, but how many people would he have to kill to get to the apprentice, or the master himself? Well, one thing was for certain. Plagueis wasn't very interested in the rebellion or justice, but he was quite fond of Bridger. He was content with making things even and leaving it at that. Ezra saved his life, he saved Ezra from whatever he was planning on doing. That was fair in his books. But Plagueis also had some interest in potentially helping Ezra become the next true Sith apprentice. He couldn't just say that to Ezra, so he had to put it to him lightly, by saying that he would like the opportunity to train Bridger. For a Jedi who had fought Vader twice, engaged with Maul multiple times, and met two legendary Jedi Masters in Obi-Wan and Yoda, and of course who could forget the greatest Jedi Knight, Kanan Jarrus, Ezra didn't need a whole lot of persuasion to be interested in an opportunity. He, though, would not accompany Plagueis anywhere in the galaxy. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. Just because the Sith Lord had power, or opportunities, or pathways to success through darkness, didn't mean Ezra would just join him. He'd experienced the highs of the dark side through the Sith holocron from Malachor V. He didn't have any intention to become a Sith apprentice, or to use the dark side in that capacity. Plagueis would soon learn of Ezra's story, so instead of promising the dark side, he promised to instruct as was most comfortable to Bridger's requests. Not that he'd make training easy, but Plagueis was willing to give Ezra the chance to learn. The Ghost wouldn't return to Yavin because Plagueis was a threat, so instead, Ezra would remain on Lothal for the time being to oversee the planet's protection in case the Empire returned. It wasn't the easiest decision, and he wasn't willing to just cast off the time he spent with Kanan, but he also wasn't going to revert from his past self. Kanan helped Ezra rid himself of the dark side when it was his biggest crutch. Plagueis, early into their talks, before the Ghost ever left Lothal, learned that Ezra would not train in the dark side. He simply wanted to exercise himself through the Force more effectively, if he was going to train with Plagueis, that is. The Sith Lord was left in a frustrating position. He believed that it would be impossible getting to Sidious. He still trusted in the dark path, but he also needed allies. Plagueis' friends of old were either killed off by Palpatine or died of natural causes. Sidious went out of his way to make sure that his master's legacy was destroyed following his death. He accomplished that before the Clone Wars ever started, though as much as Plagueis wanted to return to being the one in control, he also recognized that he needed to be as much of a learner as he was an instructor. Ezra was very invested in the fight with the Empire, and he would not forego that, leaving every other week to assist his friends with various missions on behalf of the rebels. But in the time that Ezra wasn't with the Ghost, he'd be exchanging information with Plagueis. It all started with understanding Ezra's Jedi lineage, which piqued the Sith Lord's interest more. Ezra came from one of the great lineages, the Shatterpoint lineage. Plagueis knew of both Mace Windu and Depa Billaba, two of the youngest Jedi to ever find themselves in the Council chambers. Incredible Jedi, even to his disgust. Kanan would have made a fine knight too, had Order 66 not happened, and that was a compliment Plagueis was willing to give. However, with Ezra being a part of the Shatterpoint lineage, he had every reason to assume that Bridger could harbor similar talents to Master Windu. To be a Sith Lord and instruct a Boken Jedi Vapad would be nearly impossible. The entire situation was bizarre as it was, but Plagueis recognized that he would never have a capable student if Ezra didn't utilize the dark side to some capacity. Maybe not to the level or depths of a Sith, but maybe more akin to the Night Sisters. Wait, the Night Sisters were killed off too? So while Plagueis began his instruction of Bridger, he also learned more and more about the galaxy. It changed drastically, and much of what happened before Ezra was born, during the Clone Wars, was ridiculous. Sidious held a firm grip over the galaxy, but never would he suspect Plagueis being relevant at Lothal. Vader wasn't going to be sent to some backwater world anyways, because there was no reason to try and control Lothal. It wasn't important to trade, supplies, or technology. It was just proof of the Empire's desire to overexpand itself, even if it was in spite of their overall success. For that, they lost Grand Admiral Thrawn. Plagueis truthfully was solely interested in what Ezra could be for himself. But because his student was, well, Ezra, it wasn't easy for him to just coerce the boy into utilizing the dark side, or even having selfish instincts. There were minor attempts, but eventually Plagueis recognized that it was futile to try. Ezra was no Palpatine, and that's not because he didn't harbor great gifts, but because he was a street kid. His personality was vibrant, and in some ways it gave Plagueis a sense of joy. Not that he was just overly happy to realize his former apprentice succeeded without him, but in the fact that he could humor the young Jedi. Palpatine was brooding, the Sith way was fierce and focused, and Bridger was the latter too, but also found more ways to just enjoy other aspects of life. His connection to the Lothals or some other animals was intriguing. It all started with the Purgle days and eventually weeks before. Plagueis, perhaps unlike a traditional Sith, while versed well in combat, was a master of the Force. Ezra was receiving insight and teachings from one of the most gifted Force adept Sith in the entire Bainite lineage. This was a pathway to information beyond what even some Jedi in the Republic era could have taught Bridger. As a result, the two of them expanded their connection through information, because despite his great knowledge, there were things Ezra knew that Plagueis didn't. Connecting to Purgle, accessing the world between worlds, speaking to dead people. Plagueis hadn't done any of that. Ezra also made sure the Sith Lord remembered that. It was troubling because Ezra would intentionally rage bait Plagueis and he'd almost fall for it a number of times. But in a funny way, the amount of rage baits Ezra pulled on him made Plagueis loosen himself up. This kid wasn't ever going to be like Palpatine, because he was a free soul. That was perhaps the greatest intrigue for Plagueis as well, while also being the biggest difference between the Boken and regimental Jedi. An individual like Ezra wasn't bound to a code. He harbored attachments. He used darkness lightly. He willingly made Jedi-like decisions but had the wherewithal to not be stupid enough to destroy himself in the process. Sure, the Purgle plan probably would have put him in a bad position, but it certainly wouldn't have killed him. There was an ingenuity to Bridger's tactics that made Plagueis respect the Jedi in Ezra, more than he ever respected anyone else from the Jedi sect before. Of course, there were two overarching reasons for Plagueis' continued patience with Ezra and willingness to align himself with the Jedi. It had to do with the fact that this was no longer his galaxy, nor his kingdom to rule. Palpatine was the only Sith Lord, and Plagueis would be considered a rival. Secondly, was the fact that he had theoretically died. Maybe he didn't literally cheat death, but he seemingly manifested it enough that some 18-year-old kid born 13 years after his death was able to cheat it for him. So, he was in, and as a result, with the formidable training that Plagueis could give, Ezra progressed unlike he ever had before. With the weeks counting down to the revelation of the Death Star by Lothal, Lord Plagueis and his new student discovered something new. As someone who came to understanding his own lineage, Ezra became more open to utilizing powers like Vaapad. Plagueis didn't value lightsaber combat in the slightest, but he was a remarkable duelist. This was passed on to Ezra, who utilized more than the typical Jedi Padawan did. Instead of basic Form 1, Ezra had a mix of forms, because he was Boken. He learned Form 3 from Kanan, whose master, Depa Billaba, favored it before her death. Kanan also taught Ezra pieces of Form 5, which was one of the methods Kanan preferred to use. Not to mention, Ahsoka showed Ezra holograms of Anakin's holocrons, helping him tackle pieces of Form 4. Plagueis believed the Jedi teachings were rubbish, especially for an acrobatic combatant such as Ezra, so he was instructed Form 7, and despite not knowing Vaapad personally because he was a Sith, they developed their own iteration. For Plagueis himself, it would be the anti-V, due to his usage of the dark side overall. This development made them better warriors, and it was nice for Plagueis to actually teach someone who was grateful. Maybe the months since his return made him spiteful of Sidious, but his new student always thanked him after their sessions. Regardless, without an attack on Lothal, Ezra was buzzing to help the Alliance, and Admiral Raddus needed new power cells for his frigate. So, with so many other forces preoccupied, Plagueis and Ezra would take this mission. Thanks to being a supportive aide to Ezra, Hera was willing to trust the former banker. The rebels needed any support they could get, and these power cells were on a transport heading to the core. So if they didn't get in and get out, they'd be stuck. Well, yeah, they got stuck. It wasn't really their fault, but the schedules for the vessel flipped. No one really needed to be blamed, but the Imperial crew contacted the core for support when they found 2 Jedi inside their cruiser. As a result, Lord Vader and Merrick would be dispatched to handle the Jedi stowaways. Vader was only accompanying because he had been on Coruscant hunting for Plagueis with his master for weeks. When the Inquisitor and Vader walked into the transport, they found no trace of the Jedi. Plagueis eyed Sidious' new apprentice, beyond surprised that he seemingly betrayed Maul. Ezra never spoke of Maul because he didn't really think there'd be a connection for Plagueis. The Sith Lord also never asked because he assumed Palpatine had multiple apprentices, due to the Inquisitors and the name Vader. This creature, though, was nearly as tall as himself. Its muffled breathing was quite terrifying, and his powerful structure painted an individual with nothing to lose, the perfect asset. Plagueis recognized that Vader wasn't an apprentice, he was a tool, and so the 2 allies lunged in. Merrick flung his saber to life to counter Ezra's emerald blade, and Plagueis' crimson weapon dragged down towards Vader, who buried it. Without even drawing a connection back to Sidious' master, their sabers collided. Ezra and the Inquisitor battered their weapons. This wasn't the same Ezra who refused to kill the 7th sister on Malachor. He was a hardened warrior, and with the Inquisitor bearing down on him, he swiftly moved between Forms 3 and 5, to Plagueis' disgust. He, on the other hand, wasn't fighting the same Vader that lost to Kenobi. This Dark Lord was controlled, and a master of all 7 lightsaber forms. Plagueis' training with Ezra prior to this really helped, because he had to be gentle with Vader. Like the Jedi General from the war, Vader used his metallic limbs to bear down on his opponents. His strength was unlike anything Plagueis had seen, but due to his own natural physical advantages, Plagueis was able to parry against the apprentice relatively easily. Their weapons shrieked, and the two Sith clobbered their way towards a victory that remained unseen. Ezra, despite his better training, wasn't fully comfortable with utilizing Form 7 against the Inquisitor, but bouncing between the other forms wasn't doing it. He rolled around, batting Merrick's blade into the wall and spinning behind him so he could use the Force to throw Merrick into the wall. The Inquisitor spun his saber and turned it at Ezra, but the young Jedi jabbed his weapon between the handles and pulled up, ripping an explosion that crushed through Merrick's armor, impaling him and sending the Force essence into a shriek of dust. Ezra turned towards Plagueis, who was bodied physically into the wall. He didn't fall over, but he braced himself up. Multiple strikes followed, and Plagueis refused to break, before shoving his hand forward as electricity poured out of his hands, covering Vader's suit. It hadn't occurred to him that Sidious might be afraid of this technological terror, and Vader reeled the instant he was hit by electricity. Plagueis grinned, and Ezra stepped back, out of the way, as he watched the Sith Lord that Plagueis had been hiding for the past few weeks show itself, even during the battle for Lothal. Ezra didn't see this version of his instructor, and it was truthfully terrifying. A yellow hue lit Plagueis' eyes as he ripped more electricity into Vader's body as he stumbled over him. The Sith Lord kicked his opponent in the face mask and dragged his saber across his arms, leaving Vader defenseless. Plagueis didn't even realize how significant it was to strip Vader of his limbs, but he persisted, putting his saber away and firing the full power of the Force through him and into Vader. The apprentice cried out in agony as fire ripped across his few inches of still remaining skin under the suit. Just like Mustafar, he couldn't escape the pain, and Plagueis told Vader that this was only tiny in comparison to what his master would face. Vader wheezed before his head was removed with a slash of the saber. Ezra held his own weapon before his chest, almost protecting himself from Plagueis, and the Sith Lord turned to him and picked up Vader's head. He reminded Bridger what the Sith were, what they were capable of. This monster had done much worse than he faced in his death, and Plagueis was no different. Sidious was the true and only target, and Ezra rebuted him, asking what would satisfy his revenge. And Plagueis stopped his mid-step and told his apprentice that the destruction of the Sith Order and Palpatine's empire would, before he continued walking out. To Bridger, this didn't make a lot of sense, though as they mounted Vader's head on a pike for Palpatine to find and grab the power cells, it would become all abundantly clear to him. Plagueis would reveal what he had decided to be his new reality. The Sith religion mattered to him, the concept, the usage of the dark arts, that specifically. But the rule of two had forever been ruined for him. He bent and broke it for the betterment of himself and his apprentice back in the day. Sidious would pay for that ultimate betrayal. Though Ezra brought up an important and even interesting point to Plagueis. After all of his revenge was complete, he'd still be left longing. Ezra reflected on his time in the dark side, using that Sith holocron from Malachor. He found victory frequently. He progressed in his powers, but he gained so little. So often did he feel empty and forgotten and lost. The Sith holocron only took for him, and it gave him so much short-term power, but he was isolated from everyone he cared about. Ezra paused, before completing his thought by telling his new friend that he felt like a shadow. Plagueis was confused then. Why was Ezra allowing Plagueis to teach him? And Bridger shrugged his shoulders with a slight smile, partially because he believed that Plagueis was more than just a Sith, partially because they were a pretty decent duo, and this led to another question, but it wouldn't be asked. Plagueis hadn't shown any signs of the light or letting go of the dark, but that also wasn't the point. Ezra wasn't looking for evidence or a change within the Force. He believed, perhaps blindly, in what his friend could be. A certain optimism or faith in someone who perhaps never had that outside the dark side. As they returned to Yavin and Plagueis officially joined the rebellion, the Empire shifted. Emperor Palpatine was pissed off about everything regarding Vader's death. It was clear that Plagueis had done it, and in an effort to find his former master, he activated a contingency plan. Due to all the uncertain years, he created overlapping plans in case his master returned. Plagueis could be found and rooted out. The Death Star was complete, despite its intelligence being leaked, Instead of risking the fallout of a test at Jedha City, Director Krennic and Grand Moff Tarkin would oversee the superstation over Coruscant, where Palpatine could keep a good eye on it. As for the rest of the Empire, curfews, crackdowns, martial law, and even worse were instated. The entire population was being forced into lockdown until further notice. Did Palpatine fear his master? Perhaps. Seeing Vader's mangled body didn't bring him a lot of self-confidence, but he would make his master crawl out, and he would crush him. This new counter wasn't just for Plagueis but the rebellion too. They were deeply problematic, and due to his late master resurfacing, finally, it was about time he utilized this contingency. However, with the Imperial Senate still being disbanded, and Alderaan remaining alive, there'd be problems for the Empire. The citizens were getting tired of the militaristic occupation of worlds. It had been a bumbling problem here or there. Of course, the ISB usually mediated it, but with the whole data leak from Dedra Miro, the ISB had its own internal problems. As a result, the people, after a couple weeks of these new mandates, would begin striking back at the ruling empire. On Yavin, though, the rebels continued to expand. Cassian Andor would work with various teams to assist them with gathering new allies. Kleia could recover, and Bail frequented the Yavin base. Ezra and Plagueis, on the other hand, operated inside the forests during the day. They were able to bunk with the rest of the Ghost Crew, but Ezra's training was a top priority for Hego. After killing Vader, he felt rather incomplete. It wasn't until that conversation with Ezra where he considered alternative options to living life, but that realistically had been his entire experience being with Ezra. The brute that instructed Palpatine was not the same instructor who taught Ezra. They were completely different versions of himself, and Bridger, frequently, brought out the best in his older friend. It was also the weird thing in their dynamic. To Ezra, Kanan was his only true master, whereas Plagueis was a friend, willing to help him out. While they developed the Anti-Vapad, Ezra was able to retrace the steps of his great Grand Master. They weren't precise, of course, because he didn't have the holocrons of Mace Windu at his disposal, but the techniques and understanding of dark and light were present. Plagueis simply telling Ezra about the legendary form of combat created by Master Windu opened Ezra's mind to the possibility of combining both. Kanan obviously mentioned it offhand, but didn't have a grip on that lesson. He was only 14 the last time he saw Master Windu, before Order 66. Their initial focus on combat was effective, but Ezra selectively chose to switch their paths so that more time could be spent on the intricacies of the Force. This time for Plagueis was quite profound. Never had he ever thought that he could grow to respect Jedi, let alone a mouthy 19-year-old Padawan. Instead of the destruction of Alderaan or the Battle of Scarif or over Yavin, the rebellion would linger in the Outer Rim, utilizing its hidden bases to frustrate the Empire. Because the Imperial regime was showing off the Death Star, they thought the people would silence themselves, but ironically, it made them more vocal. The energy initiative that Palpatine promised would save generations of people wealth, but it was just a big space station that benefited no one. The media couldn't cover up the frustrations that inevitably bubbled over into protests, riots, and massacres. Saw Gerrera, while the Alliance tried to rally people diplomatically, captured the hearts of the galaxy. He fought with his partisans in front of people. Citizens, fueled with the fire of revolution, watched a man who lost everything stand above Imperial tanks and blast stormtroopers into their graves. Saw gave harrowing speeches and demanded the removal of Emperor Palpatine. Sidious, of course, wouldn't listen, but the people did, and that's really what mattered. The Alliance wasn't nearly as flashy as Saw Gerrera, and they didn't garner support because of it. But due to the Senate disbanding and the prolonged effects of martial law packages, former senators and representatives would be murdered by their citizens. The rich moon of Coruscant, named Hesperidium, would be hit by a bombing attack, led by Gerrera, of course. Maybe the oligarchs were innocent, but were they really? Their complacency, their negligence costed lives, and the people championed their slaughter. As the Empire itself broke apart from the inside out, Palpatine attempted to threaten worlds with the Death Star. Fear was rampant across the galaxy, undoubtedly, but the concept of a single ruler threatening entire portions of the population was undeniably evil. Yes, there were planets that stopped their protesting when these threats started, but there were also more people willing to reject this attempt at grabbing power. So the Emperor, entering his Death Star, prepared to make a show of his strength. They were going to single reactor detonate a massive city on Ord Mantell. one of the rowdiest planets in the galaxy. The rebels didn't obtain this information from the Empire. It was not an ISB leak. It was the crackdown itself that led them to the system. The Empire closed off city gates, massacred a few hundred people, and messages from the population broke free and were heard from the galaxy. Essentially, the Empire tried to lock everyone in and not let them out so they could all be killed in one go. The Empire would show itself with the present fleet and the Death Star, and the rebels would make their own counter to break in. This would be Ezra's chance to reunite with his old friend, Saw Gerrera. The rebels, in alignment with the Alliance forces and Gerrera personnel, utilized a series of varying strategies to break into the starship, some with the members of the Ghost, others a part of Leia's Alderaanian Guard, and Gerrera's partisans. The Emperor was again flaunting his power, and promised to only destroy the most frustrating city. The rebels, as a side note, didn't have intel on how to destroy the Death Star, so they were simply here to cripple it on the galactic stage. This moment was being paraded around the galaxy in full sight of everyone, so if they won, it would be huge. The rebels who entered the station, through their various means, didn't openly engage in combat. It wasn't safe. The Death Star had a full crew, which put the numbers of the active personnel inside the station well beyond 2 million. It would be impossible at this capacity to fight through the corridors without getting stopped and eventually massacred. So the rebels took different routes. Astromechs were especially important, like Chopper. They'd seal off corridors, trap stormtroopers in their barracks, and so forth. Everything was specifically framed as a technological malfunction, nothing that would gain the attention of the Emperor or his command crew as they prepared to detonate the city. Tarkin and Krennic were here for the Emperor's approval. He would use this test to choose the new leader of the Death Star. Other important Imperial officers were also present, as the Emperor began speaking to the galaxy with overlaid images of Ord Mantell, which showed the people protesting and rioting like animals in hopes that something would save them. The galactic community watched in terror. This strike by the Death Star could cripple any resistance and reveal the rebels to the Empire. Palpatine spoke enthusiastically as his officers stood with straight backs and firm faces behind him. All of that was great until the doors bursted open, and Lord Plagueis' crimson saber rang to life. The cameras tried to cut, but the sight of blaster fire clipping Tarkin and sending everyone else into a fray of confusion only meant one thing to the galaxy. The rebels were here to save Ord Mantell. In the multitude of other command decks, groups of rebels got to work. Syndulla's squad shut down the access ports and captured or killed anyone who got in the way. The Alderaanian unit was in a firefight as they tried to seal their doors, while Gerrera's troops were crushing through Imperials on 2 levels. Saul was actually with Plagueis because the Sith Lord didn't want Bridger anywhere near Sidious. The former master and apprentice, after nearly 40 years of silence, returned into combat. Their blades chopped away at each other. Sidious had trained for this moment, ever since his master's supposed death. Plagueis just remained steady. Around him, Gerrera's troops slaughtered Imperials, and he would personally execute Krennic and Tarkin in front of the broadcast. Saul's scarred face and turbulent voice would sing to the people of the galaxy. He was the hero the people needed, the warrior to fight fire with fire. On Ord Mantell, the rioters broke free from the city gates and chanted into the sky, cursing that damned Death Star, and no laser would be fired. Sidious also had different plans though. He and his former instructor battered their weapons. Plagueis was finally going to end his former pupil. All his plans and deceit would be for nothing. Sidious fought with precision, darting in the Plagueis' defenses, speedily cutting through and swiping with his 2 sabers. Plagueis defended everything with mastery. Saw's crew started to disable the cannon on the superstation, as multiple members started messing with the other controls. This involved using the reserve water tanks and sewage to flood entire floors. They'd open up corridors and dispose troopers into space. The Imperial fleet nearby tried to rally troopers inside the Death Star to assist, but some of the rebel crews were able to utilize the turbo cannons and rip through Star Destroyer defenses. Ezra, on a few floors below his friend, decided to aid him. He knew the plan, but he still wanted to help, so he left Gerrera's partisans because they secured the command center. Bridger flew through stormtroopers on his way to the main command chamber. Sidious attempted to kill Gerrera, but he couldn't free himself. Master and apprentice were entirely gridlocked. Nothing could break them, except for the final blow of death. Sidious, even in his older age, was very capable, but no matter the counters he tried, his master seemed to remain a step ahead of him. This was a struggle Vader didn't face, due to his overwhelming strength, but Sidious was also falling behind because of the anti-vapod utilized by Plagueis the Wise. He used the Force to launch Palpatine into a wall, and as he landed, he flung electricity at the partisans. Plagueis, as a Jedi would, slid in front of them and blocked the burning light. The doors beside them opened. Saw almost pulled the trigger, but he saw that young man with a burning light speed into combat with the Emperor. It was a suicide mission, and Ezra pretty much knew it, but this was for the galaxy. Palpatine pulled away from his electric attack and ripped a saber over his shoulder and defended himself from Bridger. He may have had the talent that possessed Master Windu 20 years before, but he lacked the experience. Ezra didn't falter though. He attacked, and when his defenses caved, Plagueis was by his side. Bridger slipped away, allowing his friend to drag his weapon down, and cut Sidious off his feet. Ezra, utilizing their combined version of the pod, slashed his lightsaber in, and as Sidious countered, Ezra stepped back, allowing Plagueis to grip Palpatine's wrist and crush through his arm with his saber, before firing electricity into his pupil's face. Sidious wheezed backwards, as the blinding light covered his entire view of anything. Plagueis jabbed his weapon into Palpatine's shoulder, and with all of his strength poured lightning into his student. Because of the way he stabbed his student, he lodged Palpatine into a position he couldn't move from. The apprentice couldn't do anything, and was left to face nothing but electricity as it lit the room. Ezra covered his eyes and told the partisans it was time to go. As they prepared to leave, Guerrera smiled with an almost insidious laugh. He told the rebels to get clear of the ship. His communication shot down to the other bands of rebels, and he handed Ezra the detonation device. He told the boy to be the Rido, light the flame. Bridger watched the heroic warrior rush out of the room with his squad. Plagueis finished Palpatine's life by covering him in a burning sensation, only equatable to what Skywalker experienced on Mustafar. The burning, the agony, and pain wasn't something Palpatine could seize for advantage, but only dwell in until his life was taken out of him. The Empire docked their destroyers with the Death Star, hoping to stop the rebels. But with the press of a finger, Ezra detonated not just the Death Star, but the entire nearby fleet, which was attempting to stop the rebels. This would be a burden that Ezra would never live down, but an act that needed to happen. The destruction of the Death Star and visible death of Emperor Palpatine turned the Imperial power structure inside out. Raddus would be permitted by the Alliance to make attacks with his fleet, and the rebel movement only grew from there. In his paranoia, Darth Sidious, the Terrified, crushed his empire. He gave the people something to fight against. His Imperial Senate was gone. They wouldn't survive the coming conflict to destroy the Republic that would be birthed. Palpatine's death marked the end of the Sith, and Darth Plagueis would be no more, as he reined himself in, realizing that even in revenge, he never finally felt satisfaction. The words Ezra shared, which depicted an outside experience with the dark side after having never been a part of it, gifted Plagueis the chance to see change for himself. The Sith cult, the religion, it died with his choice, his decision to reject it, not wholly, but as a means to solidify himself with the Force itself. The rebellion would utilize the destruction of the Death Star to make an attack on Scarif, and because there was no Death Star, it would reveal every single major project the Empire planned on using. The second Death Star, Starkiller Base, Operation Cinder, and Necromancer, and so forth, wouldn't only be exposed to the public, would be the cause for a mass rallying around the rebellion. Despite the Empire slowly losing out, despite its inflated military power, there'd be no return to the Senate from Organa or Mothma. They were fine, and the people spared them because they made the choice to help, but they were not to lead ever again. Instead, the people anointed Saw Gerrera to be their guide, their king, if you will. But even he rejected this notion. Saw Gerrera was a hero, not a politician. Even on Onderon, he rejected appointments to local governmental positions before the rise of the Empire. He wanted freedom, and he finally got it, and instead, he would protect and assist the formation of the New Republic government. It would consist of the better parts of the High Republic, and prosperous times before that, while also creating a steady system to benefit the people. Saw would remain a cultural icon for generations, as a result of his humility. He may have been traumatized by the conflict and the losses he experienced, but it did not make him a monster. The Jedi Order would also not return, not in its traditional form at least. Ezra had no interest in restarting the Jedi Order, and Luke, without the Sith or his evil father looming over the galaxy, wouldn't be interested in joining old Ben in a crusade to save a dead religion. There'd be those like Cal Kestis and Quinlan Vos and even Asajj Ventress that kept the dream alive, but not in a structural way. Like Ezra and Hago Damask, the core code of the Jedi was their flaw. The Boken Order, which would consist of a widespread family, connecting all the aforementioned names and many more, would become the new Jedi. It wouldn't be based anywhere. It wouldn't even be taught. It would be remembered, and each lineage would utilize its own preferred method of Boken Jedi core values, most of which rejecting the old Jedi code. Hago Damask never became a full Lightsider, not really even a Boken Jedi, but he did find peace and he found his found family. It wasn't easy for him, and in the next several decades of his life, he'd have to work hard to reject the dark principles he spent a century and a half learning from, but he would find his path. It consisted of continuing his teachings and learning, with Ezra and eventually Jacen Syndulla. The Ghost family would have multiple Force users born into it, who not only learned from Plagueis and Ezra, but adored the individual who became known as Grandfather. And that, my friends, is kind of a wholesome story. Special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel, and let's talk about this story. Pairing the goofy goober Ezra up with Plagueis was a really interesting concept. Ezra's just kind of the funniest person ever, in my opinion, and he just, like, I could just see him seeing Plagueis and being like, that guy has a lightsaber, he must be a Jedi, and then trying to save him. Plagueis in this story is really interesting because theoretically this is like really out of character for him, but he did technically die, in all fairness. He did technically have like a literal life-changing experience, and that was probably the hardest aspect of this to convey. I think Ezra is one of the few Jedi that could really get Plagueis to kind of change, because Ezra isn't like a Luke. He's not like a Luke who's like kind of blindly following the Jedi path. He's more of someone who's like utilizing the Jedi path to benefit not just himself but people around him. The people around him part is what Plagueis would probably not really agree with, but I feel like the way that Ezra and Plagueis would interact would really be the one way for Plagueis to kind of come down. And it really does start with like an eye for an eye. You know, Ezra does save Plagueis' life. Plagueis basically saves Ezra's life, but there might be still like this eye for an eye kind of respect for each other. And that's really what I wanted to build their foundational relationship off of. Without that saving each other's life kind of thing, I really don't know if Plagueis would really work in this story. I think he needs to be saved by Ezra for him to realize that, like, oh, maybe this path is semi-useful to me. And more than anything, I really perceive Plagueis in this story becoming like a Night Sister, obviously not using magic, but utilizing the dark side and the Force in a capacity that doesn't naturally upset the balance. The Night Sisters don't really like terrorize the Force like the Sith do. They use like their own little thing. It's like, it's kind of okay because it's not like hurting the Force. And I think that's what Plagueis would really kind of go into. I think he'd kind of go in that way, where he's kind of like, it's, you know. So I hope you all enjoyed this story. A little wholesome, a lot of Plagueis and Ezra here, which is a really weird duo, but I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.